And we're back. It is COMP125, and it's the last recorded session pretty much for this semester. Well, first, maybe we'll do one more video after this. We'll see how it is, right? Today, and that's it. I want to talk about the exam. Today is all about the exam and review of all the stuff we've talked about throughout the entire semester, right? So we've talked about JavaScript. And if you look back at some of the earlier stuff we did, right? I'm talking about way back to lesson 1, right? It was all around, I'm just look at topics just so you can see it. The intro that we did was all around, how to do things like, I didn't talk about this, but things like that you need structure. So remember, there's 3 things. There's the structure, the presentation we talked about before, as well as the behavior. Right? So those 3 things. Hi, Joanne. Right? That's it. You're recorded forever now. That's it. Right? So those 3 things. And if you only have, if you don't have structure or proper presentation, then the behavior part doesn't really matter. And what I mean by that is no HTML, if your HTML5 is not semantically correct, or you don't have a proper format for your content. If you have no content, who cares about your JavaScript, right? One of the biggest problems I always have when it comes to clients is, you go do a new job for them and they're like, so here's my website, and it's absolutely empty. You have a couple pictures and 4 words, and they're looking at, doing a revision. And it's not a revision, it's making a new website at that point, because without content, your website is useless, right? So you need content before you can have behavior, right? Content is king, like they always say, or queen, for the ladies that are here, right? At the end of the day, right? You have to have that kind of stuff going. So you need that structure in place. So we talked about that like day 1, and we really talked about things like variables and scope and so on. And one of the first things we did, if you remember, and this is going back to your lessons, is the idea of a closure, right? So we went to lesson 1, and if I was to look at what we did in lesson 1 really quickly, I'm just doing a quick review, only because I don't want you to forget some of the basics that you're going to be asked to do. You should know all these things by now. So things that you should know how to do are things like the closure, right? An iffy. What is that? Why do we use that? Why do we use this closure? Why not just have it like this? You could, if you really wanted to. And you might see a lot of JavaScript that's just done like this. Why don't we just do JavaScript inline, like with a script tag, like inside an HTML document? You could, but it doesn't mean that you should. It's not good practice. It opens your site up to more manipulation. It also, the way that variables are placed in JavaScript, you should consider them cached in the browser, which means as soon as you expose variables to to other parts of the code, that means there could be errors and other kinds of mistakes that can occur. So that's why we created some kind of closure like this, right? An iffy, right? This is right from lesson 1. We also talked almost like the first lesson about random numbers. Like this is like something you should know, right? Hint, hint, random numbers will definitely 100% be on your exam, right? You need to know how to create random numbers. You should know how to, what this thing means, and why do I do math.floor if I want to, compare it to just doing this, math.random. The other thing you should know is that random numbers aren't truly random. They're pseudo-random numbers. You should know that. We use random numbers for testing a lot too, especially when you want various results, random results. So we do that kind of stuff, not just for games. Games obviously need those, but you need to know about how to create random numbers. And the whole math function, the math class, if you will, right? So again, we did this like from day 1. We kind of did this piece, right? So you should know about this. How to declare variables, right? The different kinds of variables, like Boolean, number, string. Those are the types. There's also undefined, null, and any, right? We talked about those, and how Visual Studio Code can help us. If you hover over a variable, you can know the type by hovering over. Now you can recognize this because this is like TypeScript. TypeScript gives you if you ever want to know how to declare a type in TypeScript, it's random number and colon, and then after the variable is the type, right? You still need to use the same JavaScript types, but that's it. Do you need TypeScript for the final exam? No, you do not, right? You have to use TypeScript. You don't have to use modules. I introduced these topics to you because they're advanced topics, right? So you should have been exposed to some kind of API, which I have. The final project or the final assignment, which is to do a banner ad, that final assignment is to give you to use an API. Now you could apply the same knowledge to any API, right? Application programming interface, whether it's Google Maps or whatever you want. You should be able to now understand, if I was going to incorporate stuff, what the basics mean. You should feel somewhat comfortable. Should you feel 100% comfortable? No, because this is just your first course in JavaScript, and there's going to be others that you're going to use JavaScript, right? For example, if you take any kind of other more advanced course like emerging technologies one day, and it's done by different professors. But if you do that course, it's heavily to do with JavaScript, right? You can't do anything advanced until you know the basics, and this is kind of the basics, right? So really, there's 3 technologies you should really learn with the web, which is HTML5 and CSS, and you should learn those together, right? Because one kind of doesn't go without the other, but a really good understanding of most HTML5 and CSS concepts. And then a pure course on JavaScript like this, right? So you should know that. And then some kind of advanced frameworks. You should learn about those kind of things. And lots of practice, right? Because if you don't have enough practice, I mean, even if you've learned about it, you forget about it, right? Just like if you learn Java one day, you'll learn Java, or maybe if you're doing Java now, next semester you'll learn Java, and then you you forget about C# because you did Java, right? It's all about Java. So you don't forget. It's the only way not to forget is to do, right? And that's a very challenging thing to say to beginners, right? So that was lesson 1. And then lesson 2, we went into, just going to go here like this, and we'll look at these things. We talked about different things in lesson 2, right? We talked about things like how to hook into, and that's why I like to say it, hook into your elements on the page. The only way for us to connect and send data to the page is to create a hook, some kind of, you can do it through ID, through a class, through different methods, and we talked about that. And then the other thing we talked about is how to create like event listeners and event handlers. That was like from day 2 or week 2, right? And honestly, I would say that event listeners and event handlers are an advanced topic. That's not something that you should learn day 2. It's part of the book. But event listeners, making something click on the page and all that kind of stuff is the reason why it's advanced is because you have to understand the whole process. And you guys, again, just scratch the surface about how it works. You create there's different ways to make event listeners and event handlers. This way is my preferred method, the add event listener method with the type of event in quotations. But there are other ways. Like, for example, first p tag, first paragraph tag dot on click is the same as this, right? It's just on click is a method that's not preferred, right? This is the preferred method, right? And also you can do things inline. If you were going to do script inline and with your HTML, which I highly don't recommend. I don't recommend those at all. Just like we don't want to do styles inline. Inline styling, inline scripting. Why? Because it's only for that page, right? And if you want to use the same stuff and reuse some of your code, you want to use it inside of a document like this, an app.js, or some kind of external document. Because if you use it inside of a page, then you got to repeat yourself. And one of the concepts you got to take away from this course, from COMP125, Programming 2, or Programming 1 even, is don't repeat yourself, right? The dry concept of something called dry, don't repeat yourself, right? Because if you repeat yourself over and over again, it's just rework. And if you're doing a lot of rework, it's costing you money, right? If you're developing something. So you want to reduce the amount of money it costs you, because money is time, right? Money and time are kind of interchangeable, right? The more time you spend, the more money costs you or your employer, and you don't want that. Rework is one of the #1 things you rate. If I was going to be your manager in a software development company, I might rate you on rework. How much rework do you have? If I have to keep redoing my code, that tells you how efficient you are as a developer, right? If I have to keep doing it over and over again, that's bad, right? So So the idea of creating functions, and we can repeatable code inside functions, and so on, and how JavaScript deals with functions and so on is very interesting. It's different, and there's different ways of declaring functions. We talked about that. We can declare a name function. We can do an anonymous function, those kind of things. We can also do an alias for a function where we have a different way of declaring functions. For example, like this format where you say var and then the name of a variable that points to an anonymous function. That is equivalent, right, to first paragraph as something like this, right? Function and the name. This is a name function. In proper use, this has a lot of, you'll see a lot of this, right? There's tons of stuff out there like this. And the reason for this is because of the stack and the way things work, right? So the stack, when you do an anonymous function, it does not save a memory, inside the stack. It creates something, and then it's only temporary. It's there, and then what happens is we create a variable that points to it. It's almost like a pointer as opposed to holding the whole thing in the stack, right? So it runs a little quicker. But that's a topic of another course. The ability for us to execute a function, we call the function, right, with parentheses. The parentheses is just an operator. I want you to take that away, right? The name of the function, and then the parentheses being an operator, right? The two parentheses basically saying, call me. That's what it means, right? It's syntax for that. It doesn't matter whether you do it in this language or any other language. It's an operator. I want you to think of it like that. So that's lesson 2. And lesson 3. What do we do in lesson 3? Well, a bit of more. We did Bootstrap in lesson 3. We talked about that. We did more of this stuff. We started talking about arrays, right? And how we use arrays, how we declare arrays. There's different ways of declaring arrays. This is one of the ways of defining your arrays, right? A paragraph array. And we talked about how to cycle through arrays. There's different kinds of looping structures that allow us to go through arrays. There's different ways of declaring arrays. There's this way, with the 2 square brackets. This again is an operator that says make an array, and as well as this way, which is using the constructor syntax, right, for making an array. Both ways are just the same, right? They both create empty containers for the array without anything in them, right? And then we assign we assign data, initialize different elements of the array with data. And there's different ways of doing that, whether it's explicitly like this or through a looping structure, right? So that is really all around lesson 3 about arrays. Let's keep going, right? Lesson 4. Let's go back one. Lesson 4. Now, why am I doing this? Because these are all the things you should know. If you don't know some of these things, I mean, we're going to use a lot of that stuff on the exam, some of it anyway. May not be all of it, some of it. We can't use, no way I can hit you with everything, right? That would be too long. Like it would just be, for you to be tested on every part of this stuff would be too much. Again, lesson 4, we built on what we did in lesson 3. We talked more about event handling, how we, hook into different elements and then create different kinds of buttons. We talked about how to detect if an item exists in a page, which is very, very valuable, right? So you don't get an error. You can say something like, if the element, this variable exists, right, with some kind of data, then do something to it, right? So you kind of hug it inside of a container like this, like a code block, right? So this code block only functions if this resolves true, right? In other words, can I hook into something that's a contact form? Does contact form, that ID, does that exist on the page? If it does, then check for it, and then I execute the code that's inside the code block. Otherwise, ignore it. That's a good way of checking between pages. We also talked about documentation best practices and how to use, how to talk about, almost like a Java doc-like way. It's called JS doc or UE doc. Remember we talked about UE doc. Let me just bring that up. So if I was going to go to UE doc or JS doc, It gives you just the documentation best practices. So if I go to the syntax reference here, and how this would look, you should be familiar with this kind of a syntax for internal documentation. So that was around, again, lesson 4, right? More about how to use paragraphs and arrays. We talked more about that stuff at length, actually. But more about event handling. Okay, and then let's bring that up again. Lesson 5. Multiple pages. We did a lot more pages in lesson 5. And how to switch between pages, right? We talked about the whole idea of page switching, right? There's different ways of doing it. We can switch on document title. So we can look at the document object, right? That's what we did around, talking about the document object. And then the document title represents the title that's inside the title tag, right? And using the title tag, we can switch and call different functions, right? Different functions, almost like a function map, if you will, right? So we kind of go through it, and then we use a function map to kind of select or execute different functions according to which page you're on, right? And again, think about a function as a little closure, right? Another closure within our big closure, which is the iffy, right? And then the idea of having functions within functions is totally normal in JavaScript. Not so normal in other languages, right? Because other languages could give you different errors depending on how you create that structure, right? One of the biggest complaints of JavaScript is the idea of this function within functions, right? They don't like that. People look at it and go, that's like spaghetti code. Why is it done this way? Because it solves problems. The idea that we use different other elements to hook into the page, like get elements by tag name returns an array back to the paragraph tag, right? A paragraph variable. Where if you want the first element in the elements that are returned, you have to look at the 0th element, because you're looking at paragraph is now an array of elements, right? Unless you put this in. This tells us that you're looking at the 0th index of the array that you're going to get back when you do this get elements by tag name. It's saying, hey, get all elements that match the p tag, all p elements, right? Paragraph elements. And then there's different ways of injecting content. There's inner HTML, which injects HTML. There's inner text, which is only text, or text content, they're equivalent. And also doing things like using the DOM object to do things like inject other content, like title and URL and so on. We did a bunch of that stuff. Let me take a look here. And that was one of the things we talked about in lesson 5. Again, you may think that there was, we kind of skimmed the surface on a lot of stuff, and we did, but there's a lot of things we covered right in this course. Also things, of course, ancillary technologies. GitHub, you should know GitHub. You should know how to do cloud computing with Azure. You should know how to use package managers that are front-end package managers like Bower and NPM. Those are the things we use to get packages to build up our environment, if you will, and also to grab packages from the internet instead of going to the site physically and saying downloading the package, unzipping it, taking the parts, putting it into their places. It's too much work, right? So using a package manager like Bower is the way to go. Also, there was examples of, that's why I've left this in here, web.config. If you want to make your extensions work, web fonts. We talked about web fonts using a Google font, right? And I think I've actually installed it here. Let me see if I did. I did. This Google font Open Sans is what I've been using pretty much since that day. And how to use that, whether it's fonts from Google or whether you're using local fonts through in other ways. That's the way to do it, right? We have to kind of tell Azure with the web.config file how to do that so you don't get an error. That really weird font error. That was that. And also, if I go back here, that was really it in lesson 5. But lesson 6, let's see what we did with lesson 6. Oh, yes. More query selector. Actually, it's very interesting. Query selector and jQuery, right? jQuery comes from the idea of using query selector. Query selector and query selector all. query selector, selects only one element, right? So if I say div.row, it's, as an example, a div, all div tags with the class of row. That's what this returns. It returns an array of elements typically, but the query selector, as opposed to query selector all, only returns the first element that it hits, right? So the first element that has a class of row, or a div tag that has a class of row, return that and assign that to this parent element. We did that. And also the idea that you can insert elements before or insert elements afterwards, and in general DOM manipulation, how to do that. Also things about the BOM, not the document object model, but the browser object model, and how we can get information about the inner width and inner height of the actual window object, which is the browser, represents the browser. Right? Also, how we can look and see what, from a navigator perspective, what the app name is of the browser that's being used. Also, how to use things like geolocation coordinates, like the location.coordinates, where location is part of the window object as well. And we can get latitude and longitude as long as the user allows us to, which is very valuable when we're first building something like a restaurant site, or if you're shopping at a local store and they want to know the distance that you are from a pickup or delivery perspective. It's not a bad idea, right, for them to get that information from you. But it's also, we also discuss privacy, around this, and how you can't stop them from knowing, even if you try and do something like using an object or a browser in privacy mode. As long as you give permission, it takes your coordinates and sends it to them. Even if you use some kind of proxy, it'll still send you coordinates because it understands where you are, right? So we talked about that. We also talked about how to use the style method and change the actual CSS style right in line. We did that. So we can say, if I look at a particular element and I can say style.display, I'm changing the display property of the row of the element to none or block or whatever I want to do. And we talked about how to do special effects like that. So that's all in lesson 6, right? We did a little test as an example, and then in lesson 8 we came back swinging with, if I'm not wrong, shortly after that, with a little bit of ajax, right? We talked about ajax. Let me just talk about that. Or it was objects first. There was objects first. Wow, this is one of the most important lessons you could take away, this object syntax stuff, right? Where you have an outer closure called, with that was kind of variable with person is pointing to a closure. Here we go. And inside there you have the idea of a constructor, and that things like functions within functions can be considered things like methods if they're part of a class structure. This is your JavaScript class structure. Yes. You won't have to do it. No. You won't have to. Well, should you do it? You might think you should do it, right? But you don't have to. It's like an option? No, it might help you to know it, right? So or at least if you don't know this syntax, you should know the Typescript to do a class, right? And you should also know if there's some playgrounds out there, like for example, if I go typescriptlang.org, which remember, it's going to be an open book exam, and if I go to playground, and if I want to formulate a class like person, it's going to translate it automatically for you on the side, right? So even if I want to do something like, instead of person, I want to do something else, like for example, student, right? And the student is going to have a name and also some kind of, we'll say, student number. So student number or student ID, which will be, instead of a number, it'll also be a string, right? And the student, as an example, he doesn't speak maybe, but he studies, right? Then student is studying, right? Is studying. You can see that what happens on the side here, right? That the idea of creating a function, right, and attaching it to a constructor. So here's our constructor syntax, right, where we use this, the keyword this, to really talk about the context, or it refers to, the scope, if you will, as a scope object. This is the scope of, what does it mean? Here, And this is that scope. Inside this closure, inside this little function, because all functions are like little closures, right? This refers to this structure, this scope right here, right? So what I'm saying is I'm attaching dynamically a property called name to the function student. And once we do that, that becomes a constructor, right? So here's the constructor. And then what I want to do is using the prototype keyword, I take the method studies and I attach it, I add it to student. Think about it as if you're going to replace prototype with add child, right? Like how we learned about adding an object onto another object, a container. Well, think about the constructor as a container object. And all I'm doing is, when I'm creating a class, is I want to add a, with prototype, the prototype keyword adds a, this particular anonymous function, which we're assigning to studies. I'm assigning it to the student constructor to create a class with a method that's called studies, right? And then, of course, what we're doing is when we return student, if I do this, if I return the student, right, then student, capital S, is equal to student, the one that's in here inside this closure, which means now student, capital S, has access to things like the function, which is the constructor, as well as the method, which is something that we use prototype for. All right, so again, if you don't remember how to do that, you can do this, right? And the other thing is the idea of inheritance. Prototypal inheritance is a lot different than this. If I use the extends keyword here, so example, if a student wasn't just a student, but it also was a person, which it would be. So here's my person class again. Let's go back to that, right? And I'll have a constructor here that's very similar, where we have a public name string and a public age number, right? Like we had before. And if this person, as an example, says hello, right? That's the public says hello method, right? Which returns void. That's all TypeScript, right? And we can say something like console log, this dot name plus the plus operator being a concatenation operator to add things together, right? Says hello, right? And then if I take the student and I make it so that it automatically has a name, but I want to add a student ID, then I don't have to do this here, right? But I can do this, extends in TypeScript, right? Extends person, right? I can do that. And I have to make a call to the superclass where I pass in the name of the object. I should probably put that back. Sorry. Public name, or actually be name instead of public name, name string. Where I kind of do one of these, I just kind of send the name in there. And the other thing, of course, is it needs an age, which I would have to probably ask for. So let's say I would say age, which is also a number, right? Just changing it up a little bit for you guys to see the difference, right? So I kind of add that, call the super constructor, right? And then you can see now that the student class inherits from person. This is, you've seen this before. This is C#, this is Java, this is whatever, this idea here, right? Once you know object-oriented programming, and this is what it emits. It's pretty crazy, right? String, top string. It's pretty crazy, right? Because this is like, it kind of creates this little structure here to mimic classical inheritance. It's not classical inheritance. What we're doing actually, it's functional inheritance, it's prototypal inheritance. But you see that this is what it does. It uses the extends method, right, to create a prototype, another prototype. Again, so this is TypeScript, right? So you kind of learn about TypeScript in the second half a little bit. But beyond this crazy structure, the things that you should know is this. This is definitely, you should understand objects. You should see the prototype keyword, and you should know that you're building a class with the prototype keyword. It's a building block, right? That's what it's about. The idea that I can create new user objects, right? And user objects, if you look at the user class, there's a user class, right? The user has things like ID, the username, password, and email, right? And if I click the new user, I actually can put in anonymous objects, and I can, kind of create an array, if you look, of users, an array of users, right? And the other thing we learned about arrays is that in JavaScript, which is unfortunate, is that they can hold whatever you want, right? They don't have to be one data type. They can be any data type you like, which causes problems, right? Or can cause problems. But it can also solve things, make solutions happen, right? So the idea that we want to use the window object with an event listener of load to wait for everything to load before we call a method, right? It's almost like waiting for everything to load. On load, basically, you could write it that way too. Window.onload is equal to init, right? Which means that we'll call the init function, which is up here, right? Is there an init function? Maybe I didn't put it in here. But we call the init function, right, when the window loads. There it is. There's the init function. And then once the init function loads, we can declare different objects, like the person object, as an example, or in this particular case, create an array of users, right? That kind of stuff. That's all lesson 8, and it was an important lesson, right? Okay, that's that one. What else did we talk about? Right. jQuery was later. First, we talked about Ajax. The idea of Ajax. We talked about things like, or did we do strings next? Oh yes, strings and email patterns, as well as things like regular expressions. We talked about regular expressions and the regular expression pattern and how it works. Where regular expressions, again, you have your / here, as an example, and then your / down here. And between the two /, right, you have this caret. Here's a caret, right after the /, and this $sign that says, hey, this whole thing is part of the pattern that I'm looking for, right? And each square bracket is another area to evaluate, right? That's what it does. And there's different, we talked about what each of these things meant. For example, the star as opposed to the plus, right? What does it mean? What's the star compared to the plus? What does star mean? Right? Regular expressions. Optional. Plus means 1 or more, right? Does this mean 0 or more? Right? That's what it means, right? And so on. And again, we talked about how this all works when it comes to the email pattern, right? How you can create an email pattern, and how maybe email pattern is not a great idea because there's lots of different ways of doing it, right? We also created an example of a deck of cards, right? We did it right here. We did it also in COMP123, right? So people who did programming 2 with me, they got the idea of making a deck of cards, and we did it. You could see how much it was different here with new cards. We created a card object with faces and suits, right? This card object's the idea of that. There's the constructor. That's all it had, faces and suits. And then what we did was we created, a deck of cards, right? If I hover over it, it says a deck that has an array of objects of type faces and suits, right? So we did that more on this day. There's lots more string manipulation. We talked about going too lower and all that kind of stuff, all around, different things around slicing, pushing and popping from an array. And remember that the arrays and strings are very similar, right? Whereas an array is really an array list in JavaScript, and a string is more of like an array of characters, right? Which is the way you should think of them. Okay, both have a length property, but they are a little bit different. Okay, so that was all around lesson 9. And to be honest with you, I would have, like I said, I probably would have, if I was going to reorganize the course, I probably would have put that down back here, right? Because it's, we learned about strings, then we're learning about them again. Lesson 10 was all around Ajax, I'm pretty sure. Let's see, because lesson 10, I also made a little example with MongoDB, right? I showed some of you this one, where you create something called an XHR object, right? So first we create a variable called, something like XHR. We just made different ones: address book, nav data, footer data, and so on. With the XHR object, we started talking about there's a few steps to making the everything work, right? And let me go back down here to point this out. The first part is we have to declare our new object, right? With Ajax, right? And we use the XML HTTP request. If we're not using jQuery, we have to do this XML HTTP request, right? If you're using jQuery, it's far easier. But in this particular case, we also have to use the open. We open up, a particular URL or URI, right? And we use different methods, whether it's to get or post, depending on what you want to do, right? And then what we're doing is we use the send request to send your request across. So we open it up, and then we send it across, and then we wait for everything to be ready, right? We wait till the ready state change method to trigger, and we do that we can do that inline, right? Or we can use a named function. Here we're using a named function called read nav data. So if I go to read nav data, what it looks like, it's here, right? In our callback method, right? We're going to do something like we're going to wait for the ready state to equal to 4. So we're ready, right? It's basically it's complete. The load is complete is what it's going to say. The status is 200. And then once we have this ready state 4 and status of 200, then we're ready to do something with the data. We know the data has been loaded, right? Why? Because if we didn't have this, the data, because it loads asynchronously, it means that we could try and access data that doesn't exist and get an error, right? So we have to wait for the data to load, right? And that's why we do this piece. So again, we're saying the data is loaded and everything is okay, right? Status 200, that's what it means. Yes? You may have to load something from using Ajax. You may. I'll see if I can simplify it. Maybe you won't, right? But you should know it. You should know this structure if I was going to do it. Should you need to know, do you have to use it this way? No. If you really want to use jQuery, you can use jQuery method as well. That's one way of doing it, yes. And we also talked about breaking things up so that you have partial files. We did partial files here as well, where we load not just the address book, but footer data, as we have here, and we also have our nav data. This is our nav bar, right? So it loads our nav bar and our footer data. And the nav bar, what it does is it puts the data inside this main nav element. That's what it does. And we use the inner HTML to make sure it's HTML that we're putting in there. We're reading the response text of the data that comes back from our XHR request, right? Yes.
You know, you said the set active page function.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the whole part for each page, is it required to set it as active?
Only for Bootstrap. Well, we're using Bootstrap. That's why when I set a class of active for each of the list items, right, for that contain index about projects in contact inside of our, if I go back to my index.html to show you, right, so we have our main nav that's going to appear here, and then on the footer is going to appear here, and we're going to use the partials that exist inside of our partials folder, where your nav bar partial has all the data for your nav bar, right? But if you notice in here, inside the list items, you have an ID of index projects about in contact. And what we want to do is we want to inject a class of active, because the class of active shows our link darker. And that's only because of Bootstrap. Bootstrap has CSS on the back end that looks for an active class. But if you didn't have Bootstrap, then you'd have to make your own, right? In other words, I'm just showing you a way of making the look and feel of the nav bar so that it looks like it's been visited, right?
It's looking for the page itself. But
no, it's looking for this. The XHR request, right? What's happening is we're looking for an ID of index inside of our list item, and if it does exist, or projects, or about, or contact, then it recolors this list item so it's darker. Right, the background of the list item becomes darker, and the foreground becomes lighter, and so you can see that it's been visited. That's how we did with this stuff, right? Is this the only way to do it? Absolutely not. Did I have to use case statements here? I could have used if statements as well. I could have said if home, right? If this thing exists, right? If document.getElement by ID index whatever exists, then set attribute. I could have done that way too, right? But you know, we did it different ways. Okay, so that's what we did really with Ajax. We learned how to load data from a file. We had address book data, and we talked about Ajax more than XML because Ajax is, you know, kind of the de facto standard these days of sharing data, right? The idea of Ajax is, you know, set up in something like what looks like objects. These are Ajax objects. That's why it's called JavaScript object notation. That's what JSON stands for, right? And Ajax reads the JSON data, right? And then sets up things like, here's our properties, right? So ID, name, and email, and where you have values, so key value pairs. So the key would be the property and the value, right? Separated by the colons, and everything has to have quotations around it. So you have, this is an ID or an object. And of course, we also have all the objects inside of an array. So an array of different objects, that's what this thing is, right? And again, key value pair. So the key is the name of the array, context, and then the value is the array itself, right? Which is this thing here, this structure. And of course, everything has to be surrounded with these curly braces that really describe the JSON file, right? This is the code block of the JSON file, right? So we learned about JSON and how to load that up and how important that is, right? Because JSON data, we exchange JSON data all the time. For data exchange, it's the most common data exchange format right now, right? For any API, where they're using things like Google Maps or you know, YouTube or whatever, we use a lot of JSON for data exchange format. Okay, so we talked about that, and that was week 10. All right, so we're kind of you know, not so long ago, right? And then after week 10, we finally hit jQuery in week 11, right? And jQuery, again, is a helper library, the most common helper library out there right now. We use jQuery for everything, for validation, for form validation. We use it for things like helping us with Ajax. And I think I talked about this before. We have these objects, but we didn't use any of them anymore. We can use simple Ajax, for example, that does something like this. So if I want to load my nav bar, I can go $, which is Ajax. Or sorry, jQuery. I say, hey, jQuery, when I put the $ in place. Load up this stuff, this HTML, right? And then put it into our main nav. That's what it means. So load up this HTML. And by the way, we need a callback function when we load that up, right? So what are we going to do? We're going to, we can do a little callback function if I want to, or if I don't want to, I don't have to, right? I just did this and set up the active page. Right? Well, you don't have to. This callback function triggers when the loading is complete, right? Which is beautiful. That means like everything is in one. I know what I'm targeting. So what you know, element I'm targeting. I know what I'm loading. I'm loading data, HTML in this particular case, and then I have a callback to respond to when the data is finished loading. That's good. These are all wonderful things, and it's all shorthand for something that takes a lot more work with JavaScript. That's what I wanted. I mean, I don't use jQuery for everything, but 100% I would always use jQuery or something like that if it's working well. You know, a known library for something like Ajax. It just makes life easier. And same thing with the footer. We did the exact same thing. I loaded the footer partial, the HTML, and I populated it into the footer, right, as an example. And then we did a callback function to do things like, hey, put the year and the date and all that in the inner text of the year element. We have a year element that's inside the footer object, and we can, you know, kind of put that in place. We also were able to use the $, so Ajax, jQuery.getJSON. This is way easier than doing JSON reads. We don't have to wait for objects to be ready and the ready state change and all that stuff. We don't have to do any of that stuff. It's all built in, where we say $.getJSON. And then what file you're getting, this file, you're reading this file. And then you have a callback function that reads the data, and we can use the data to do something with it. We can also use a small, instead of a for each, we can use the $each function, which basically says for each of our contact in our contacts collection, right? We want to loop through each of those contacts. This is another way of doing a for each loop. Typically, I don't do this. I use JavaScript, which is I use the for each methodology. But you know what? There's a lot of real good advantages to doing it this way as well, right? So we talked about jQuery a lot, and how we can use things like method chaining with jQuery, which is really a cool thing about jQuery. Like for example, I'm targeting the first H1 element, and then what I'm doing here is I'm saying, hey, the text. I'm setting the text because there's two methods for text. I can set or get the text. Set the text to hello world, right? Change this color with CSS, so I don't have to go style dot, color dot, and then I don't do those kind of things. I can just say CSS. When I use CSS, it's like saying style in JavaScript, right? And then I have my key value pairs again. I have the key, which would be the property color, and I'm changing it to red, right? And so on. All the CSS. I also talked about how you can do special effects with jQuery, like animation effects and moving things around, changing the opacity, and all that kind of stuff. We talked about those things. Do we always do that? Typically not, unless you want to do things like jQuery is one thing that's really used for things like navigation, right? If I want to use some kind of drop-down menu that's really nicely smooth, right? So you can use jQuery for that. So it kind of, when you hover over it, it kind of expands the navigation if you really want to make it look nice. But we've gotten away from those things of late. Why? Because you can't hover with your finger typically, right, in a mobile device, and we want to do things mobile first, right? So that's why we don't do those things as much, with jQuery anymore. We used to. Oh yeah, so that was really around lesson 11, right? Lesson 11. One thing we did in lesson 11 also is we also introduced the idea of typings, right? Which is a helper class, a helper library we got with the NPM Node Package Manager, right? And what we can do with typings is it gives us code hinting for jQuery, right? Which we don't normally get. If I hover over jQuery, you can see that this is a generic iterator function that is a for each loop for jQuery, right? And the same thing goes with our load method. Here's our load method that's built into the jQuery library, right? Which tells you what it does, right? It says, load data from the server and place the returned HTML into the matching element, right? That's really cool. A really quick and easy way of doing that to create partial files. That's really cool, right? But we can do that by, we hover over, we get hover or IntelliSense, if you will, by using typings, which is part of TypeScript. Do we have to use TypeScript? No. Can we use parts of it to give us enhanced intelligence, if you will? Yes, we can. And we can use TypeScript is really for us to get better tooling so we have less errors when we create our JavaScript projects, especially when they get larger. The larger JavaScript project gets, the more error prone because it's using this kind of unstructured syntax sometimes. Okay, so we talked about that and how to put those things together. That's all in lesson 11, right? Lesson 12, we started talking about other things, more interesting things, right? And let's bring this up so I can show you. So if I go to my, again, we're using typings, right? And if I go to my app.ts, this is the first time we've actually created a TypeScript file, right? Here's my app.ts, right? And we also talked about how TypeScript is, kind of an intermediate step between here, where we are in ECMAScript 5. Most browsers, they're compatible with something called ECMAScript 5, which is a standard for JavaScript, right? But we're moving towards a new standard, ECMAScript 6, or ECMAScript 2015 is what it was called when the latest version of JavaScript was created and deployed. And that uses a different structure. It uses other keywords like class. The same idea that we talked about earlier with our playground, right? This stuff here in our playground. This is preparing you, it prepares you for the latest version of JavaScript, which is ECMAScript 6, because it has these features inside of it, right? So TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript that helps us do JavaScript a little easier and bridge the gap between where we are today in ECMAScript 5 and tomorrow with ECMAScript 6, when we have full browser compatibility, which we don't yet, right? Now this is a compiled language, so we have to do something called transpiling. Transpiling means to convert from TypeScript or emit JavaScript from the TypeScript file, right? In order for us to do that, we have to set things up for that to happen. Like, for example, a tsconfig.json file that tells us the target of what it's going to emit to, which was ECMAScript 5, right? The module style, which is common.js that we're using, and to produce source maps for us so we can do troubleshooting with TypeScript. That's what it does. That's the compiler options. Will you have to use TypeScript on your final exam? You will not have to do it. Would you? Should you do it? I would say yes, because it's going to help you, right? I'm not going to make you do it. If you want to use pure JavaScript, it's up to you, right? But it's an enhanced feature. Why wouldn't you? Once I've learned TypeScript, right, I always use it. It's like not using a tool that's much easier for me to use. Does it take a little bit of moments to set up? Yeah, it does. But I'm going to give you everything you need, right? So I want you to know this, that the stuff that you're going to get for your final exam will have TypeScript enabled. So everything will be perfectly ready for you to use TypeScript with a tsconfig.json file. I'll do all those things. Anything you need to do for the exam will be all there for you. You don't have to go and grab a package or try and figure out how to configure this stuff. It's all going to be pre-configured for you. Why? Because in real life, if you're going to do another project, you'd have these templates. So therefore, why would I make you go and do them? You have it. I'm going to give it to you. Here's your template for TypeScript. I'm probably going to give you an indexed HTML page, fully filled out with whatever you need, right? And then I'll ask you to do certain things with it. I don't know. I can't tell you that. That would be too much information for you, right? I do know, but I'm not going to tell you. The idea of using typings. So what we did here we didn't not just introduce TypeScript in lesson 12, but we also introduced this new API, which by the way will 100% be on your exam. I'm telling you right now, create.js, because I want to see how you can use an API, right? It kind of is a culmination, right, of all the little steps we've done throughout our JavaScript time here, like things like creating variables, how to use things like arrays, all that kind of stuff. This stuff does it, and how to create objects, right? Like this idea of using the new keyword to create a stage on the canvas. You should study this stuff because you'll be asked to do it, right, on the exam, right? You should know how to do this stuff because, again, it's not create.js I'm testing you on. It's everything. It's all those little piece parts to make. If you can make create.js go at the end, right? And again, you have access to all your code, right? I'm not stopping you from having access to your code. I'm not going to say you have to memorize it, right? I don't have to. You have to memorize nothing, right? Your memory is on Google, right? That's what you have to do, right? Or you're on GitHub. Look at GitHub. You'll have access to everybody's stuff on GitHub. You'll still have to produce something, right? And you have to do it on your own. You can't combine with anybody else. You can't look at anyone else's work, right? But it'd be something that you've seen before. A lot of the stuff that I'm going to tell you how to do is right here, right? Well, you need to create things like objects. Now, remember, in week 12, we didn't do anything more than a label object, and we talked about something called a module. But remember what a module emits to. It emits to this, another closure, right? Another closure. Here's the closure here, and then inside there we have the label object, which actually is in another closure, right? And I also talked about how to extend the extends keyword, which extends from create.js text. Will you have to know this for the exam? No. Will it help for you to know this for the exam? Yes, it will help you, right? Because it'll make you faster, right? Remember I talked about, do it right the first time or don't repeat yourself, right? That's the way to go, right? So that's the that's the way we want to kind of we want to do things. We talked about modules and how modules help us split our code, across files, as opposed to just have all of our code in one file, which is kind of ugly, right? It means that it might be a huge file. If you're someone who is a novice at JavaScript, you might see one huge long file of stuff, and you're trying to look through for one thing in your JavaScript file. Imagine if you had to write that in C#. One huge, massive file in your program file, but you have nothing else. You have no other classes or anything. It's mad. It's crazy, right? It's like trying to find stuff like a needle in a haystack. We would never do it in real life. In real life, we always split across files because it makes it easier for us to, troubleshoot a chunk of code as opposed to this massive book of code, right? It doesn't make any sense, right? So that's why I've talked about modules here. Do you have to know modules for your exam? No, you should know about them, right? Should you have to use them? No. Will it help you? Yes. right? I keep saying that because it's true, right? Right? Don't be afraid of it. Oh, modules, right? It's not the big deal. It's like what you do with it, you just create a module, which is a namespace in TypeScript, right? And then there's 3 parts to modules, which I talked about, right? One is you have to have it somewhere in another. I usually put it in the folder of the module name or the namespace, right? Module namespace package in Java. You'll learn that. Package means namespace in Java, right? When I look at objects as an example, that is the folder that I'm keeping my label class inside of, and I use the module keyword, right, as an example. This is the first piece. Anything that I surround these curly braces, around this whole thing here, this is the entire module code block, right? And it is a closure. It's like doing an IFI. If I use the export keyword, I return the class label. I return this other closure outside of the module. It exposes the class if I use the export keyword. If I don't have the export keyword, the class is only local to the module. So the scope, this class label would live and die within this scope, which makes no sense. I'd have to expose it if I want to use it somewhere else, right? So I use the export keyword for that. By the way, this whole methodology is something that's coming in ECMAScript 6, right? In one form or another, right? Okay, so now it'll future-proof you a little bit. You'll know a little bit about ECMAScript 6 and the syntax. As you're moving forward, you'll see the syntax over and over again, and if you have to use JavaScript in the future, you'll know a little bit about it. All right, so that's step 1. Step 1 is declaring the code in your module and put it inside a folder. Step 2 is actually attaching it to your index.html. We talked about that because all external modules, as well as all of your external libraries, have to be attached to your index.html. If they're not attached, they're not loaded into the cache of the page, which means they will not be accessible, right? They have to be on the page, have to be listed here, right? That's step 2, right? Notice how jQuery is listed, Bootstrap is listed. We could also use CDNs for that, the content delivery network, instead of actual files here. But somehow you have to list them on your page, whether it's a URL or whether it's a URI or some kind of path to a local file. They have to be listed. And so too is my label.js. Notice that it's JS, not TS, because TS is not recognized as a file type for browsers. Modern browsers do not recognize TypeScript. Maybe one day they will, right? We don't know. Chances are not. But it's JavaScript, right, that we have to convert to. And of course, we have to transpile from TypeScript to JavaScript. And we have that, the counterpart. So this is TypeScript, and when we transpile, it becomes JavaScript. And this is the thing that gets added into the index.html page, right? So that's part 2. Part 3, with TypeScript, you have to use some kind of reference. And I recommend that if I go to the app.ts page, at the top, you see that I have a reference path, this little path that connects to the object, right? So the label.ts, it helps the compiler or the transpiler understand all the pieces of the module, of the application. That's all it does. It helps us with IntelliSense, right? So those are the 3 pieces to creating a module in TypeScript, right? The actual module itself in some kind of folder. 2, connect it to your index.html. 3, make a reference to it at the top of your file, right? Or somewhere. Yes? You don't, no, because we use what we did was when we have a inside, there's 2 ways to transpile things if you're using TypeScript. If you're using Visual Studio, the big Visual Studio, when you press save, it transpiles automatically, right? That's it. That's all there is to do for Visual Studio. If you're using Visual Studio Code, you have to set up a task runner. And the task runner typically looks like this, right? The task runner you use with Control-Shift-B would set up a task runner, right? Or on the Mac, Command-Shift-B. Command-Shift-B on the Mac will ask you for the type of task runner you want to make. And then what you do is you set up things like your arguments. In this particular case, when I initialize the task runner, it will use the -W command, right, to watch for any changes in your TypeScript. That's what it does with the W command. You could certainly do it, like you said, with terminal. So if I was going to do something like open my app in the terminal window, I could initialize something like this. I could say TSC, right? So I want to transpile everything. I can do it that way. It transpiles everything that it finds. Or I could use TSC minus W to create a watch. Right? It's transpiling, and it's also watching for any file changes. That is definitely a one part of our a potential process. But why do that when you can do something like this, which is built into Visual Studio Code? That's why I use Visual Studio Code, because it has a built-in task runner to help us transpile automatically, so we don't have to use anything else. All right, so that is really TypeScript a little bit in a nutshell. We talked about it in week 12. Last week, week 13, we finished off talking about what you need for Create.js, and we did two examples. You know, kind of more of a label example with more about this label, how to set things up, how to move labels around, how to rotate them, how to do all this kind of stuff, as well as a button. And we talked about how to create a button class, right? And so we have two modules now that are part of, or you know, two pieces of that are part of the same module. We have a button class that's part of the objects module, which extends the Create.js bitmap, right? Class, and also a label class that extends Create.js text. So both those are part of the objects module. I also talked about how you can continue to extend a module by just declaring more of module objects. If I keep going module objects over and over again, it's not going to repeat. Actually, what a transpiler does is it only extends the module, so it'll become a massive module at the end. Right? That's what it does. One thing we haven't talked about, which you know, I can talk about today, just a brief thing. You know, if I go to tsconfig.json, notice that in tsconfig.json we have different things again. Our target, ES5, a module type, common.js. There's different module types. You can also do system.js. There's other ones there, also AMD. Other ones, module methodologies, if you, or patterns, module patterns, right? For example, Node uses common.js, right? Node.js. And you know, the latest versions of React and so on use system.js, right? So it's just another way, another pattern for module. Yes? Everything you'll need will be inside of your template, right? Everything you need will be inside your template. Right? If it's up to you to make it, to activate it, right? You have to activate it all. Okay, so that is your compiler. But let's say we have all these different modules, right? And one of the things that gets big, and I'll share with this with you. You don't have to remember this for your exam, but I want you to extend the stuff we talked about. If I was to go with lesson 13, I'm looking at lesson 13 here, and I want only one file to be created instead of multiple files, because right now, if you look at my index.html, I have multiple files here. These two multiple files. So labeled.js, button.js, and app.js. Whew, that's crazy, right? And as I go, by the way, this is nothing. If I actually make a full-blown application, I might have 40, 50, 60, 100 of these files. It becomes too crazy, right? Why? Because as these files grow, I do continuous GET requests from the server. I keep doing GET requests, a GET request, a GET request, a GET request. The more of these GET requests I do back and forth slows down how fast my page loads, right? And I don't want that. Remember we talked about one time that the longer time it takes for the page to load, people leave. They say, see ya, after like 2 seconds, or like, something's wrong with this page, I'm leaving, right? We can't wait 2 seconds in line anymore, right? Because you know, we've got the attention span of flies, right? It's like we have to leave right away. Ooh, can't stay 2 seconds. So the same thing, we try and make it so the page load is faster and faster. And the way to do that is, instead of having these files here, first of all, if in a production environment, all of this right now would be CDNs, right? So using the content delivery network, I would use URLs to cache all of my libraries, because they're the exact same libraries over and over again, right? Why would I try and serve them from my site? So that's number one. I would change these to CDNs. And two, I would make all this into one file, right? And how to do that? Well, there's a really simple way. It used to be much more complex. There's a really simple way to do that with TypeScript. Under source maps, you can do something like another option called outFile, right? So if I go outFile, I can specify a file in my folders, right? So for example, if I do something like, I want all my files after they've been done, right? See how it scripts? I want to put it somewhere. Like for example, I want to say something like scripts, and spell properly, builds, right? Builds, and then I call it app.js, right? If I do this, just to show you what it does. And if I press Command-Shift-B to transpile, right, it'll kick off the transpiler. And then all of a sudden, inside of my scripts folder, I have something called builds. I have an app.js, right? And inside my app.js is everything, all my modules and my app.js all in one. Why is this good? Because at this point I can minify everything or uglify. I can use uglify.js, which is another module. Let me download it for you so you can see what I'm talking about. I don't expect you to remember any of this. I just want to show you why you would do something like this, just so you know. If in an interview someone asks you, right, you should know the answer to this. If I go something like this, if I say npm install, and I'll say something local, we'll install things like. I'm wondering if I have that in there. I probably don't. But uglify JS, right? By the way, if you don't know if it's available for npm, you can always do an npm search, uglify, right? And then it'll build the index. After the index is built, it'll say, it looks like this, Tom, uglify.js. Uglify.js, what it does is it takes your stuff and compresses it into something that's much smaller, right? It's just searching for it to make sure that you can see if you don't know what it is. Eventually it'll do it. Yes? I'll put that up. Thank you for that. Before the day is done. JavaScript? Yes. Yes, you can. Okay, so it's looking through, and it found an error. I love it. Let's just do this. We'll say npm search uglify didn't work. But let's say if I wanted to find the uglify module in npm, I could always do that. I go npm uglify, right? If you wanted to find that, or uglify.js2, which is fine too. Here's uglify.js2. How do I install it? Uglify.js2 means just it's like another version of uglify. Here's the way you do it: npm install uglify-js2, right? And how do you use it? Uglify.js2, whatever the input files are, right? And then the options. And then the output. Where did the output file go? Right? So -o tells me where the output file goes. And then my input files, where they come from. Uglify.js2 is how you use it. So let's install that so I can show you what it looks like. Right? So I go something like npm install uglify-js2. Right? So it installs it locally for the module. There it is. Now I can use it. Right? Now I can use it by saying something like this: uglify.js2, right? And then I give it the path of where the file is. So my input file, which would be, remember, it's under scripts. So scripts, right? Builds app.js, right? And then the out file -o is scripts builds, right? And we'll say app.min.js, right? app.min.js, right? If I press that and press enter, uglify.js not found. Because why? No, because I didn't do it. Uglify, maybe I didn't spell it right. Uglify.js2, maybe I didn't do it properly. Or maybe it's not installed inside my thing. But that's the way you do it. You just put that in there, and then you would do it when it's working. I can also specify source maps as well, which is what I would want, right? Which is the exact same. Source maps gives us code hinting for how to do stuff, right? So the quick fix to this, of course, would be to create an npm. If I go npm init, right? This is one way of doing it. And then if I press enter, so actually I'll say COMP125 lesson 13, and then I kind of accept everything, right? And if I do the same thing, if I go uglify.js, right? Mine save, right? It'll save uglify.js inside there, right? Inside my module. If you look at the actual project itself, now you'll have a node modules file with uglify.js2 inside here, right? Should be able to do uglify.js2. Let's see if I can do it. Uglify.js2. No. And it's because of ZSH, right? So that worked. We just uglify JS. So that's the way you do it. You would do something like this. You would say, let's try this again. I'm going to go up a couple of steps. So there, I'll just change this to uglify JS instead of uglify JS 2. It's the same thing. And then it says, can't read file scripts build app.js. Maybe I put it in the wrong way of doing it. So let's try it out. So I'll say uglify inside lesson 13. Maybe it's just scripts build, or it's dot scripts build. I got to use the methodology. Hold on a second. It's pathing, right? So local pathing says that I may have to put something like a dot / sorry. Dot / and then try that again. There we go, it's done. Now if I clear, and if I go back to my files, just to show you what it looks like. So here's my scripts. I have, and if I refresh, here's my app.min.js. Look what it looks like. I've minified everything. So one file is all this. Now what effect does this have? Right, just to show you minification really quickly. That's why I did this, right? But if you look at lesson 13, and if I look at the file size for my my scripts, so if I go back to my scripts and if I look at my, just really quickly, if I look at my objects, in the objects I have two files. My JavaScript file is 1 kilobyte and for a label, and my other one is 2 kilobytes for a total of 3 kilobytes, right? So sometimes what happens is, why we do this is because our app.min.js is 3 kilobytes. There's nothing gained, right? But it took away all of the, it's so small, that's why. But it took away all of the white space. White space is all gone, and everything has been renamed. All the variables have been renamed where it can to smaller variables if it can. Sometimes it cannot. Anything in quotations and stuff it can't. But it looks like everything has been stripped away in this minified block format. This is very common. You'll see this all over the place, a minified version, right? And if I want, if I also want source maps, I can do the same command, right? With -- source map, if I'm not wrong. And when I go there and check it out again, it'll actually add in source maps as well. So I have a app.js, app.min.js.map, and this is the source maps involved for this thing, which is really quite cool. Yes.
If someone is minified, right?
Yes.
It's possible to
expand it?
Yeah, take the minified and
not really. Like if I was going to go to the minified file, as an example, well, you could expand it, but it wouldn't look right. It wouldn't look right. So here's my minified file, app.min.js, as an example, right? And if I wanted to, if I kind of Control or Command A, and if I said format code, right, it would try, but this is the best it would be able to do, right? Can't really unminify this. You'd have to go step by step and then do it yourself by hand, which is totally against why you're doing the minification in the first place, right?
No, what if you already have that?
No, there's nothing you can do. It's not an easy process. But why did I do this? So why did I do this? Because, and I'll leave you this before I stop recording, right? You do this because inside your index.html here, let me just fix this up for you so I can go like one of these, right? So I don't have to use all this anymore, right? I would just do script with a source of scripts, right? And it would be under builds and then app.js. That's it. So one file to rule them all, right? Why? It's faster. It gives me one access, one GET request to the server instead of 3, right? Which makes the file load faster, and that's why we do minifications. Of course, this wouldn't work. It would be app. What I really want is app.min.js, which is even faster, right? Could I minify other things? Yes, I could. I could have all my image files minified. I could minify a lot of different things, fonts, a bunch of other stuff as well. Now, how about these libraries? Could I convert these to CDNs? Right. Well, let's take a look. Remember on CreateJS? If I go to createjs.com and I want to get started with createjs.com, I can see that there is the easel.js here's my my stuff for my my CDN, right? So I could use this for easel.js, right? Remember, I'm only using easel.js, so I don't really need the other ones at all, right? Just this one. So I can take this script. If you wanted to use the other ones, there's a CDNs for the other ones, but I'm going to show you this one anyway, right? So if I copy this one, sorry? There's other kinds of tools. But I can replace all this, right? Because all we're using is easel.js. I can replace it with this, right? And so this is the CDN. And I could just hide this stuff, right? So that I've got two requests instead of a bunch of these ones. And the same thing goes with this stuff, right? So there's my CDN for jQuery, for create.js. Let's do the CDN for jQuery. So if I go to jQuery, right, just to show you that they exist everywhere. And if I want to use the CDN for jQuery, I can certainly look for it. Usually they have it right here, but that's okay. Even if they don't, I'm gonna. Oh, here it is. Here's the Google CDN for jQuery. Right, there's the 2.x snippet. There we go, 2.2.4. There's my CDN. Right, so here's jQuery instead. Right, and the same. So I could get rid of these two as well. So I have two more requests, but they're nothing that's local. Just to show you, I need also the CDN for Font Awesome if I want to, and the CDN for Bootstrap. Hold on a second. Let's see if we get the CDN for Bootstrap. So get Bootstrap. Because it make it faster. Get started. And I can get the CDN for Bootstrap. Here it is, 3.3.7. Right? So I can grab this whole CDN right here. So latest compiled and minified CSS. I can get the CSS, right? So I copy this piece, and I can go up here to here instead of the inline CSS in here. I could certainly put in the CDN. So there's the CDN for that, right? And I can get rid of this piece, right? That's my CDN. And I can do the same thing for my optional theme, which would go here, right? For Bootstrap. Yeah, so you can do that for Bootstrap as well, right? Oops. And you're like, well, why would we do the other ones locally? Well, you do it for testing, right? Because when we test stuff out, we want to do things like this. And let's take a look at this as well. Here's the latest one for our script for Bootstrap right here. This is right here. Copy it. And go away to the bottom here where we have Bootstrap and put that underneath jQuery. There's our Bootstrap stuff, right? And what about for Font Awesome? One more. Font Awesome, right? If I go to Font Awesome and I want to get the CDN for Font Awesome, right? So I want to go download, right? Let's see if I can figure the CDN for Font Awesome. So it's CDN, sorry, CDN. Sometimes I have to do this, Font Awesome. There it is, Font Awesome, min.css. So.
Does it go with the version specific or?
Yeah, versions there. So here's my Font Awesome. So I'm going to put that in place there, right? Oops. Oh. Sorry, I have to put this inside here. Anyway, it's nothing's easy when you want to do it. All right, so I've got everything that I can. I've got everything to on my CDNs. I've minified everything, and now let's test it to see if it all works, right? We don't need the files, but we use them anyway because that's for development. We use them, right? So if I was to test this out, and again, I go back to here, I can say light-server, and then run locally, and we still have, if I refresh everything, I still have everything that we normally have, right? It still works. And to test to make sure that I'm not lying, that it got everything from saying, right? So you can see for yourself that my, you know, that's down here, all these are crossed out, right? So I'm using the jQuery Bootstrap and our create.js, ezo.js, as well as our one simple file to do everything, right? Well, yeah. I mean, the load times, if you want to see the network, you could always compare the network times as an example here, right? So if I was to reload, you can see that the total load time and what each part takes to do all of it, right? And you can see that bootstrap.min.css, right, where it comes from and so on, the different GET requests and so on, and for the total time it takes to load everything. No. So again, you know, I just wanted to share that with you. That's the final result. We couldn't get to that last week. Do I need you to remember that for the exam on Wednesday? No, you don't. But should you know about minification? Should you know about, you know, CDNs, content delivery network? And we talked about that a little bit, where we can get them from the servers as opposed to our own files. Yes, you should know about content delivery network. In a production site, we would do it this way. If I was going to really produce something at the end, it's much faster to use CDNs than to use your own files, right? So that way it loads and it's more efficient. Now, don't worry about the internet being down. If the CDN doesn't work, the internet's down. And if the internet's down, don't worry about it because your site's down too. Yeah, it is. So we did that. So we did all this in week 13. We talked about how to load stuff up, right? So let's take a short break, and then I'll take questions. I'm not going to record the questions because, you know, there's no point recording the questions. But I'll ask you. You know, I'll take questions, any kind of issues you guys have for the remainder of the session today. And then next time when we get together, remember, please come in on time on Wednesday, because we're going to start sharp at 12:30. And then we'll go for 90 minutes, approximately an hour and a half, and then we're going to be stopping, right? So I'm going to ask you to do a few things for 90 minutes, and once that time is done, you're done, and then we'll see you later, and then all your marks will trickle down by the end of the week, I swear.
Did you say get our marks before the final or after that?
I may have said a lot of things. Anyways, let's continue. All right, so let's continue. All right, thank you so much, and I'll take questions now.